1948. Palais de Chaillot, Paris. A 64-year-old woman stands before the nations of the world. In her hands, she holds a document that will change the history of humanity forever. But no one in that room knows that this same woman, decades earlier, was called the ugly duckling, rejected by her own mother, and considered so unattractive that her family hid her from visitors. How did she get there? What transformed a loveless girl into the most influential woman of the 20th century? This is the story they never told you. October 11th, 1884, New York. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt is born in a high society New York mansion. But there is no celebration, no joy. From the moment her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, sees the newborn, something breaks in her eyes. The baby is not beautiful. She lacks the delicate features expected of a child of the aristocracy. And in a world where beauty is everything to a woman, this is a testament to her. The mother, one of the most beautiful women in New York, looks at her daughter with a mixture of disappointment and shame. The months pass, and little Eleanor grows up hearing words no child should ever hear. Granny, her mother calls her. Grandma, a cruel nickname for a girl who is barely 2 years old. While her mother throws glamorous parties and receives guests in rooms decorated with gold and velvet, Eleanor is kept upstairs in children's rooms, away from everyone's eyes. The little girl hears the sound of laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the piano music from the stairs. But she can't go downstairs. She's not beautiful enough to be displayed. In family photographs, while her younger brother and mother pose elegantly, Eleanor appears stiff, uncomfortable, with an expression of profound sadness that no child of that age should have. But there is one person who does love her. Her father, Elliot Roosevelt, younger brother of future President Theodore Roosevelt. Elliot is charming, charismatic, and funny. When he's home, the mansion fills with light. Eleanor runs to him, and he picks her up, spins her around, and calls her my little Nell, my golden girl. With him, Eleanor isn't ugly. With him, Eleanor is special. Elliot tells her stories of adventure, of travel, of distant lands. He promises her that when she grows up, they'll travel the world together. He tells her she's smart, brave, and will do wonderful things. And Eleanor believes him. Every word her father says is a balm against her mother's rejection. But there's something Eleanor doesn't understand yet. Her father disappears for days, sometimes weeks. When he returns, he and her mother argue behind closed doors. Sometimes, Elliot smells strange. He walks with an unsteady gait. His gaze is lost. Little Eleanor doesn't have the words to describe it, but years later she will understand. Her father is an alcoholic, and alcohol is slowly destroying the only person who loves her. 1891. Eleanor is 7 years old when her world falls apart. Her mother contracts diphtheria. Within days, the beautiful Anna Hall Roosevelt, who cared so much about appearances, dies in her bed. Eleanor is by her side, but she doesn't cry. Years later, she will confess that all she felt was a strange relief. There will be no more disappointed looks. She will no longer be called Granny. But at what price? Months later, her younger brother, Elliot Jr., also dies of diphtheria. The house that was once filled with parties is now a silent grave. Eleanor and her younger brother, Hall, are left motherless. Their father is alive, but the Roosevelt family makes a devastating decision. Elliot is unfit to care for his children. His alcoholism is too severe. The children are sent to live with their maternal grandmother, Mary Livingston Ludlow Hall. Eleanor hopes her father will come to her rescue, that he will keep his promise to take her on adventures. But weeks turn into months. Elliot's letters arrive sporadically, filled with promises that are never kept. Eleanor reads them over and over, memorizing every word, clinging to the hope that one day he will return. August 14th, 1894. Eleanor is 9 years old when she receives the news that will forever shatter her childhood. Her father has died. Elliot Roosevelt, the man who made her feel loved, who called her his golden girl, has died after years of struggling with alcohol. He tried to jump out of a window during a bout of delirium tremens. He died alone, broken, destroyed. Eleanor doesn't scream. She doesn't cry in public. She has learned that emotions must be controlled, that showing weakness is unacceptable in a family like hers. But at night, in her room at her grandmother's house, the little girl creates an imaginary world. In that world, her father isn't dead. He's simply on a trip, and soon he'll return for her. She writes him letters she'll never send. She tells him about her day, her fears, how alone she feels. This fantasy will stay with her for years. It's her way of surviving, because accepting that she's completely alone, that no one in the world loves her, is too painful. So Eleanor builds an invisible armor. She becomes serious, obedient, silent. She learns not to need anyone. She learns not to expect love. And in that process, something inside her hardens. Something that will later become an unstoppable force. Grandma Hall's house is large, dark, and silent, like a mausoleum. The curtains remain closed. The mirrors are covered. Everything is designed to show the perpetual mourning of a family that has suffered too much loss. Eleanor walks the hallways with soft steps, trying not to make noise, not to disturb, not to be seen. Her grandmother Mary is a strict, old-school woman. She believes in discipline, strict rules, and that children should be seen but not heard. Eleanor is homeschooled by private tutors. She doesn't go to school. She has no friends. Her only company is her brother Hall and books. She reads voraciously. Dickens, Scott, poetry, history. Books become her escape, her window to a world beyond those gray walls. But the house holds darker secrets. Eleanor's uncles, who also live there, are alcoholics like her father. At night, Eleanor hears them coming home drunk, breaking things, yelling. Sometimes they enter her room unannounced. Eleanor learns to sleep fully clothed, with the door locked. She learns to always be alert. She learns that the world is not a safe place, and that she must protect herself. Adolescence. Eleanor looks in the mirror and sees what her mother saw, an unattractive girl. She is tall, too tall for the beauty standards of the time. Her face is long, her teeth prominent. In a world where a woman's worth is measured by her appearance and her ability to make a good marriage, Eleanor feels doomed. The few times her grandmother takes her to social events, Eleanor remains on street corners, invisible. She watches other girls her age laugh, flirt, dance. But no one asks her to dance. No one seeks her out to talk. It's as if she's wearing a sign that says, "Unattractive, do not disturb." And every silent rejection is a confirmation of what her mother led her to believe. She's not enough. But something is changing inside Eleanor. Solitude has given her something unexpected, time to think. While other girls of her social class are preparing to be decorative brides, Eleanor reads about politics, social reforms, and the conditions of the working poor. She begins to wonder why the world is so unfair, why she has so much while others have nothing. These questions will sow the seeds of what is to come. 1899. Eleanor is 15 years old when a letter arrives that will change her destiny. Her grandmother has decided to send her to Allenswood, a boarding school for young ladies in England. Eleanor doesn't know it yet, but this decision will save her. The boat trip to Europe is her first real adventure. Eleanor is equally terrified and excited. When she arrives in Allenswood, near London, she finds a Victorian building surrounded by verdant gardens. But most importantly, Marie Sylvester, the school's headmistress, is waiting for her there. Marie is no ordinary woman. She is a feminist, a free thinker, a progressive. She challenges all the conventions of her time, and she will see in Eleanor something no one else has seen. The first time Marie Sylvester speaks to Eleanor, something extraordinary happens. Marie doesn't look at her appearance. She doesn't comment on her height or her face. Instead, she asks her questions. What do you think? What do you feel? What interests you? And Eleanor, accustomed to being ignored, discovers that she has opinions. She has ideas. She has a voice. Marie becomes a mentor Eleanor never had. She teaches her that a woman doesn't need to be beautiful to be powerful. She teaches her that intelligence, compassion, and courage are worth more than any pretty face. She teaches her to think critically, to question injustices, to not accept the world as it is, but to imagine how it could be. For the first time in her life, Eleanor blossoms. She becomes popular among her classmates not for her beauty, but for her kindness and brilliance. She is elected leader of student activities. She travels around Europe with Marie, visiting museums, attending political debates, and meeting intellectuals. Eleanor discovers that there is a vast world beyond the restrictions of New York high society, and that world is calling to her. 1902. Eleanor is 18 years old when she must return to New York. She leaves Allenswood with a broken heart. She has spent the 3 happiest years of her life. Marie Sylvester writes her a farewell letter saying, "One day you will do great things. Never forget that." But New York greets her with a harsh reality. Her grandmother now expects Eleanor to do what every young woman of her standing must: make her debut into society, find a suitable husband, and become a decorative wife and mother. Eleanor tries to resist, but the pressure is immense. She makes her debut as a debutante at the famous Assembly Ball, one of the most exclusive events in New York high society. Eleanor arrives at the ball in a white lace dress, her heart pounding with anxiety. The ballroom is filled with America's wealthiest families: the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts. But while other girls are surrounded by suitors, Eleanor sits back, watching. That night confirms her worst fears. In the high society marriage market, she has no value. And something inside her rebels against that idea with a silent fury that will soon find its outlet. But Eleanor doesn't give up. If she won't be valued for her beauty, she will be valued for her usefulness. She joins the Junior Consumers League, an organization that fights to improve working conditions for working women. For the first time, Eleanor enters the slums of New York, the factories where women and children work 14 hours a day for miserable wages. What she sees marks her forever. 8-year-old girls sewing in the dark until their eyes bleed. Pregnant women standing next to dangerous machines. Entire families living in rooms with no windows, no running water, no hope. And Eleanor understands something fundamental. Her pain, her rejection, her loneliness are nothing compared to the suffering of these people. She makes a silent promise. If the world doesn't want her as a decorative wife, then she will be something else. She will be useful. She will be necessary. She will help those without a voice. She doesn't know how yet, but she feels her life has a greater purpose than simply marrying well and disappearing into domesticity. This promise will guide her for the rest of her days. But then something unexpected happens. At a Roosevelt family reunion, Eleanor runs into someone from her past. A distant cousin who has grown into a handsome, charismatic, and ambitious young man. He looks at her in a way no one has ever looked at her before. And for the first time since her father's death, Eleanor feels like someone really sees her. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and their meeting will change not only their lives, but the course of 20th century history. But what Eleanor doesn't know yet is that marrying Franklin will be the beginning of the most difficult test of her life. A test that will force her to choose between being the invisible wife everyone expects her to be, or becoming something no woman of her time has dared to be. The question is, will she have the courage to break all the rules? The answer is about to be revealed. Winter of 1902. New York is covered in snow. Eleanor climbs the stairs of the Roosevelt family mansion on 65th Street for the Klan's traditional Christmas dinner. She's 18 and doesn't expect anything special from this gathering. She's attended dozens of family events where she's simply part of the background, the serious cousin no one notices. But when she enters the room, someone immediately stands up. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, her 5th cousin. They are the same age, but they haven't seen each other in years. Eleanor remembers him as a skinny, mischievous boy. But the man walking toward her now is completely different. Tall, with a strong jaw and a dazzling smile. He's a Harvard student, popular, athletic. Everything she isn't. Franklin greets her with an exaggerated bow that makes her laugh, a rare find for her. "Cousin Eleanor," he says with that disarming smile, "tell me all about your time in England. I've heard you're the brightest of our generation." And for the first time in years, Eleanor feels like someone genuinely wants to listen to her. They talk for hours. Franklin tells her about his political dreams. his admiration for his cousin Theodore, who is now Vice President of the United States. Eleanor tells him about her work with the poor, about the injustices she's seen, and Franklin listens with an intensity that makes her feel important. The following months are a whirlwind. Franklin begins visiting her in New York every chance he gets. He takes her for walks in Central Park. He invites her to events at Harvard. He writes her long, passionate letters about their conversations, about how she makes him think differently about the world. Eleanor can't believe it. Is this brilliant, handsome man really interested in her? Doubts constantly assail her. She's used rejection to invisibility. But Franklin is persistent. He tells her she's special. He tells her she's different from all the superficial girls he knows. He tells her they could do great things together. By 1903, they're in love, but they keep their relationship a secret. They both know that Franklin's mother, Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, is a domineering and possessive woman who has dedicated her life to her only son. Franklin is her reason for existing, and Sarah has very specific plans for him. He must marry someone of his social standing. Someone beautiful, rich, perfect. Eleanor doesn't fit into any of those categories. Autumn of 1903. Franklin takes Eleanor to a picnic in Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family estate in the Hudson Valley. The river sparkles in the October sun. The leaves are in full bloom. And there, by the water, Franklin gets down on one knee and asks her to marry him. Eleanor is frozen. A part of her wants to scream yes. But another part, the part that has been rejected her entire life, whispers warnings. Why does he want her? What does he see in her that no one else has? What if this is a mistake? What if he regrets it later? But Franklin's gaze is sincere. He tells her he loves her not in spite of her seriousness and commitment to social causes, but precisely because of them. He tells her he wants a companion, not a decorative doll. He promises they'll have a life of service together. And Eleanor, who has dreamed of having a purpose, of being loved, of matching, says yes. But when Franklin tells his mother about the engagement, all hell breaks loose. Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt is a formidable matriarch. Widowed at 33, she has dedicated the last 2 decades to raising Franklin as her personal masterpiece. She has controlled every aspect of his life, his education, his friendships, his future. And she isn't about to relinquish that control. Sarah doesn't attack Eleanor directly. She's too sophisticated for that. Instead, she uses more subtle and lethal tactics. She tells Franklin he's too young to get married. She reminds him he still has to finish Harvard and then law school. She suggests they wait, take their time. Behind these reasonable words is a hope that Franklin will lose interest, that he will find someone more suitable. Franklin, for the first time in his life, defies his mother. The engagement remains. But Sarah doesn't give up. If she can't stop the wedding, then she'll control everything else. And she begins to plan the most subtle and devastating campaign of control Eleanor will ever face. March 17, 1905, New York. Eleanor marries Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a ceremony that should have been the happiest day of her life, but which is bittersweet from the start. The date was chosen because President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's cousin and Franklin's hero, will be in town for the St. Patrick's Day parade and is able to attend the wedding. Eleanor walks down the aisle arm in arm with the President of the United States. She should feel special, but she actually feels like an accessory. All the guests want to talk to Theodore. Everyone wants to be close to power. Even Franklin, her own fiancé, spends more time talking to his famous cousin than to her. It's a harbinger of things to come. The honeymoon is a 3-month European trip. It should be the most romantic time of their lives. And there are beautiful moments, walking through Venice, exploring the ruins of Rome. But there are also disturbing signs. Franklin receives constant letters from his mother. Sarah has given them money for the trip, which means she has a say in their plans. And Eleanor begins to realize that their marriage isn't between 2 people, but between 3. When they return to New York, the trap closes. Sarah has given them a house. But it's not just their house. Sarah has bought 2 adjacent houses, one for herself and one for the newlyweds, with connecting doors on each floor. Eleanor will never be alone. Sarah can enter whenever she wants, without warning, without asking permission. And that's exactly what she does. Sarah shows up during breakfast. She rearranges Eleanor's furniture. She criticizes her clothes, her way of running the house, her opinions. She's not cruel, never obviously cruel. But every comment is a small stab. My dear, don't you think that dress is a little serious? Franklin always prefers his egg like this. In our family, we do things this way. Eleanor tries to resist, but she's playing a game she's not ready for. She's young and insecure. Sarah is adept at manipulation after decades of practice. And Franklin, the man who promised they'd be partners, is too busy with his legal career and political ambitions to notice his wife is slowly drowning. 1906. Eleanor becomes pregnant. It should be a joy, but it becomes another arena of control. Sarah hires the nurses. Sarah decides how the baby's room will be decorated. Sarah tells Eleanor how she should behave, what she should eat, how she should prepare. Eleanor feels like her own body no longer belongs to her. Anna, her first child, is born, and instead of feeling the joy of motherhood, Eleanor panics. She doesn't know how to be a mother. Her own mother was cold and cruel. She has no role model to follow. And when she tries to do things her way, Sarah intervenes. Leave it to me, dear. I know what I'm doing. I raised Franklin perfectly. The pregnancies follow one another with brutal rapidity. Anna in 1906, James in 1907, Franklin Jr. in 1909, who dies at 7 months, breaking Eleanor's heart. Elliot in 1910, another Franklin Jr. in 1914, and John in 1916. 6 children in 10 years. Eleanor's body is a baby factory, and her spirit, the spirit that Marie Sylvester awakened in England, is slowly fading. Eleanor looks in the mirror one morning in 1910 and barely recognizes herself. She's 26, but feels 50. She's constantly pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Her life has been reduced to diapers, bottles, and Sarah's daily visits. The social work she loved has vanished. She has no time, no energy, no permission. Franklin is increasingly absent. His career is taking off. He was elected to the New York State Senate in 1910. He spends his days in Albany, the state capital, immersed in politics. When he's home, he wants to relax, not listen to Eleanor's domestic problems. And Sarah's always there, filling the void, making herself indispensable, subtly reminding Eleanor that she will never be enough. One night, Eleanor locks herself in her room and cries. She cries for the girl she was in Allenswood. She cries for the dreams she had. She cries because she has become exactly what she swore not to be, an invisible wife, a domesticated mother, a woman without a voice of her own. And she wonders if she will ever find a way to escape this gilded cage. But then something changes. 1913. Woodrow Wilson is elected president. Franklin, thanks to his support for the Democratic campaign, is appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position his cousin Theodore Roosevelt held years earlier. The family moves to Washington, D.C., and for the first time in years, Eleanor leaves Sarah's constant orbit. Washington is different. It's a city of power, of influence, of constant movement. As the wife of an important official, Eleanor has social duties. She must organize dinners, attend events, meet the right people. At first, she's terrified, but slowly, something old awakens inside her. She's interacting with intelligent people, discussing important issues. She's not just a mother and wife. She's someone, and she discovers she's good at it. She has an extraordinary memory for names and faces. Her seriousness, always seen as a flaw, is now an asset. She's reliable, discreet, and intelligent. The wives of other politicians begin to seek her out, and Eleanor feels her first breath of fresh air after years of suffocation. 1914. Europe erupts in World War I. The United States remains neutral, but it's only a matter of time before they become involved. Franklin is busier than ever, overseeing the expansion of the Navy. And Eleanor notices something. He's coming home late. He smells different. There are lipstick stains on his shirts. Eleanor says nothing. That's not how marriages work in her social class. Men have affairs. Wives look the other way. It's the price women pay for security and status. But something in her stomach twists every time Franklin makes up another excuse. And then she meets Lucy Mercer. Lucy is Eleanor's social secretary, a beautiful, charming young woman from a good family, but without money. Eleanor hires her to help with her social correspondence. Lucy is everything Eleanor is not: relaxed, flirtatious, fun. And Eleanor, in her innocence or perhaps her denial, doesn't see what's happening right in front of her. Summer of 1918. Franklin is in Europe, inspecting naval operations during the war. He returns home gravely ill with pneumonia. Eleanor, his devoted wife, unpacks his suitcases, and there, hidden among his clothes, she finds a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. Love letters. Passionate letters. Letters that make it absolutely clear that Franklin and Lucy Mercer have been having an affair for years. Eleanor sits on the floor of her room, the letters scattered around her, and in that moment, something inside her dies. But also, something is born, because Eleanor finally understands that the fairy tale was a lie. The prince didn't save her. The gilded cage is still a cage. And if she wants to be free, if she wants to survive, she will have to save herself. But how? And at what price? The coming confrontation will not only destroy her marriage as she knows it, but will force her to make the most difficult decision of her life. A choice between staying and becoming the most powerful woman of the century, or leaving and losing everything. And what no one knows yet is that this betrayal, this moment of heartbreak, will be the birth of the Eleanor Roosevelt who will change the world. The question is, can the deepest pain become the greatest power? She's about to find out. September 1918. The room is silent. Franklin lies in bed, still weak from pneumonia. Eleanor sits in a chair by the window, the bundle of letters in her lap. She has read every one. Every word of love her husband wrote to another woman. Every promise he made to Lucy Mercer while Eleanor raised her children, while organizing her social life, while sacrificing everything for her career. When she finally speaks, her voice is calm, too calm. "Do you love her?" she asks. Franklin can't meet her gaze. Silence is her answer. Eleanor feels as if her heart has been ripped out, but her face remains serene. She has learned all too well to hide her emotions. "I want a divorce," she finally says. The word falls like a bomb. In 1918, divorce is a monumental scandal, especially in families like the Roosevelts. It means social ruin. But Eleanor doesn't care anymore. She's lived her entire life worrying about what others think, about living up to expectations. And look where that led her, to a betrayal that no one even noticed because they were too busy admiring the perfect facade of her marriage. But then the forces align against her. Sarah Delano Roosevelt arrives like a hurricane. Divorce is unthinkable. What will people say? What will happen to the children? And Franklin's career? A divorced politician has no future, especially one whose wife left him for adultery. Sarah isn't worried about Eleanor's feelings. She's worried about the Roosevelt family's reputation, about her son's ambitions. And then there's Lewis Howe, Franklin's political advisor, a small, ugly, and brilliant man who has bet his entire career on Franklin becoming president. Lewis speaks to Eleanor not of love or morals, but of power. If you divorce him, he tells her, Franklin is finished. But if you stay, if you play this game cleverly, you could have more influence than any politician's wife in history. Which do you prefer, revenge or power? Eleanor spends sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. Her instinct is to flee, to protect what remains of her dignity. But another part of her, the part awakened by Marie Sylvester, the part that worked with the poor and saw injustices that need be corrected, that part wonders, what if Lewis is right? What if staying doesn't mean giving up, but strategizing? Eleanor agrees to stay, but not without conditions. And these conditions will redefine not only their marriage, but the role of political wives forever. She tells Franklin, I'll stay, but our marriage, as you knew it, is over. We'll be political partners, nothing more. You'll sleep in your room, I'll sleep in mine. And I won't be your decorative wife anymore. I'll have my own life, my own projects, my own voice. Franklin, racked with guilt and desperate to save a career, agrees to everything. Lucy Mercer disappears from their lives, at least publicly. She marries another man. Franklin promises never to see her again. It's a promise he eventually breaks. But Eleanor won't know that until much later. What follows is one of the most unusual marital arrangements in American political history. In public, Eleanor and Franklin are the perfect couple. They smile for photos. They attend events together. But in private, they are polite strangers who share a house and a last name, nothing more. Eleanor has learned the hardest lesson. Love is an illusion, but power is real, and she's about to discover how to use it. 1920. Women win the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. It's a historic moment. And Eleanor, who has spent the last 2 years in a kind of emotional limbo, sees an opportunity. She joins the League of Women Voters of New York. For the first time in over a decade, she has something that is all hers. Eleanor works tirelessly. She organizes voter registration drives. She gives speeches on street corners. She visits poor neighborhoods, factories, and unions. And she discovers she's good at this. Very good. She has a natural ability to connect with ordinary people, especially working women. They see in her not a patronizing aristocrat, but someone who genuinely cares. The other women in the league look at her curiously at first. Who is this shy, serious, never-smiling woman? The wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy playing activist? But Eleanor shows them she means business. She works harder than anyone. She stays late. She does the jobs no one else wants to do. And slowly, she earns their respect. She's building something new, an identity separate from Franklin, separate from being someone's wife. And it's there, in the trenches of political activism, that Eleanor meets the women who will change her life forever. Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, two passionate suffragists who live together and share a life that defies all social conventions. And Esther Lape and Elizabeth Red, a pair of brilliant lawyers who teach Eleanor about constitutional law and political strategy. These women are unlike any Eleanor has ever met. They are independent, intellectual, passionate about the causes they champion. They are not defined by the men in their lives. And for the first time since Allenswood, Eleanor feels like she belongs. These women don't judge her by her appearance. They value her for her mind, her work, her commitment. They spend hours discussing politics, labor rights, and education. Eleanor absorbs it all like a sponge. She's learning to think strategically, organize campaigns, and mobilize people. She's finding her voice. And although she doesn't see it yet, these skills she's developing in the shadows of women's activism will soon make her one of the most influential political figures in the country. August 1921. The Roosevelt family is on vacation at Campobello, their summer retreat in Canada. Franklin, who has always been vitally athletic, comes home from the water one day complaining of pain. He thinks it's just fatigue. But the next morning, he can't move his legs. The diagnosis is devastating. Polio, the disease that primarily paralyzes children, has struck Franklin at the age of 39. Doctors don't know if he'll ever walk again. Franklin, the man who bases identity on his physical vigor and athletic charm, is bedridden, his legs useless. His political career, which was just beginning to take off, seems over before reaching its full potential. And this is where Eleanor could have taken her revenge. She could have walked away, let Sarah take control, allowed Franklin to sink into his disability. No one would have blamed her. But Eleanor does something that surprises everyone. She becomes his lifeline. For months, Eleanor cares for Franklin personally. She helps him with painful exercises. She encourages him when he sinks into depression. She reads everything she can about polio, consults with specialists, and seeks out experimental treatments. Sarah wants Franklin to retire to Hyde Park, to accept his disability, to live like a wealthy invalid. But Eleanor refuses. And Lewis Howe is on her side. Together, Eleanor and Lewis form an extraordinary alliance. They have one goal: to keep Franklin Roosevelt's name in the public mind until he can return to politics. And this is where Eleanor discovers her true genius. Since Franklin can't move, she becomes his eyes, his ears, his legs. Eleanor begins attending political meetings in his place. At first, she's there only to report to Franklin, but slowly, she begins to speak for herself. Her voice, which was always shy and high-pitched, begins to strengthen. She learns to give speeches. She learns to negotiate. She learns to play the political game with a cunning no one expected from the serious and shy Eleanor Roosevelt. 1924. Eleanor is 40 years old, and the woman looking back in the mirror is no longer the insecure girl who married Franklin 2 decades ago. She's lost weight. She dresses with more confidence. Her posture is more upright. But the most important changes are internal. She no longer apologizes for existing. She no longer seeks anyone's approval. She has assumed leadership roles in the New York Democratic Party. She's the editor of a political newsletter. She gives speeches across the state, and people listen to her, not because she's Franklin Roosevelt's wife, but because what she says carries weight. She speaks about minimum wages, 8-hour workdays, factory safety. She speaks with knowledge, with passion, with authority. Franklin, meanwhile, struggles to recover. He's accepted that he'll probably never walk again without assistance. But he's learned to use braces and canes. And he's learned something else, that his illness has made him more empathetic, more profound. Suffering has changed him. And when he looks at Eleanor, he sees someone who has also been transformed by pain. 1925. Eleanor makes the most radical decision of her life. With her friends Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, she builds a house in Hyde Park, but not in the main mansion, which is dominated by Sarah. Rather, it's on a separate property next to a stream called Valkill. It's a modest cottage made of stone, surrounded by trees, and it's all hers, for the first time in her adult life. Eleanor has a place of her own, a refuge where Sarah can't enter uninvited, a space where she can be herself. She sets up a furniture factory there, employing local workers. She establishes a progressive school with Marion. Valkill becomes a symbol of her independence, the place where the real Eleanor can exist away from expectations and masks. Franklin visits occasionally, but he understands this is Eleanor's territory. Their marriage has become something unique. They are political partners who respect each other, but are no longer intimate. They live parallel lives that intersect when necessary for their shared ambitions. It's not the marriage Eleanor dreamed of, but it is one where she finally has power. And Eleanor discovers another passion, teaching. She joins the faculty of the Todd Hunter School for Girls in New York. 3 days a week, she teaches literature, American history, and current events. And in those classrooms, she pours everything she learned from Marie Sylvester into her life. She teaches her students to think critically, to question authority, to not accept the world as it is, but to imagine how it could be. The girls adore her. They see her not just as a teacher, but as a model of what a woman can be. Eleanor takes them to visit courts, factories, and slums. She wants them to see the real world, not just a gilded one of their privileged families. And in the process, she becomes a mentor she herself had in Marie Sylvester. She is creating the next generation of women who will not accept the limitations imposed on their gender. 1928. Franklin decides to return to politics. He runs for governor of New York and wins. Everyone talks about the miraculous return of the man who beat polio. But Eleanor knows the truth. She's back, too, not as an invisible wife, but as a political force in her own right. But what Eleanor doesn't know yet is that this is just the beginning, because in 4 years, in the midst of the worst economic crisis in American history, Franklin will be elected president, and Eleanor will become First Lady. But she won't be a First Lady like any other in history. It will be something no one has ever seen before, and something many in the country aren't ready to accept. The question that is about to be answered is, can a woman completely redefine one of the most traditional roles in American politics? Can she turn the position of First Lady, which has always been ceremonial and decorative, into a platform for real power? And most importantly, is she willing to face the hatred, ridicule, and fierce resistance that will come when she tries to do so? The answer will change America forever. October 1929. The stock market collapses. In days, entire fortunes disappear. Banks close. Factories lay off millions. America sinks into the worst economic crisis in its history. Once prosperous families now line up for free soup. Men who had decent jobs now sell apples on street corners. Children go to school hungry, with torn shoes, with a blank stare of someone who is known despair too young. Eleanor sees all this. She travels through New York as the state's first lady and witnesses the suffering. She sees pregnant women fainting from hunger. She sees war veterans living in cardboard shacks in the parks. She sees children scavenging. And something inside her snaps, not with weakness, but with a determined fury. How can it be that in the richest country in the world, people are starving to death while politicians debate and fortunes continue to accumulate in the hands of a few? Franklin is in Albany, trying to implement state-level aid programs. But the crisis is too great. President Herbert Hoover, faithful to his conservative philosophy, refuses to allow the federal government to intervene directly. He believed the economy will correct itself, that government aid will create dependency. Meanwhile, the country bleeds. 1932. Lewis Howe enters the room where Eleanor is working on correspondence. Franklin is going to run for president, he says without preamble. Eleanor stops typing. Her first thought isn't pride or excitement. It's panic. Being First Lady of New York State was one thing. But First Lady of Nation? Living in the White House? Being under constant scrutiny from the entire country? Eleanor tells Lewis she's not sure she wants this. She's built a life. She has her school, her work with women's organizations, Valkill. How can she abandon all that to become a ceremonial hostess in Washington? Lewis looks at her with his trademark intensity. Think about what you could do with that power, he says. Think about how many people you could help. It's the right argument. Eleanor doesn't want power out of vanity, but power to serve, to change things, that's different. She agrees to support the campaign, but with reservations. She doesn't yet know that this decision will make her one of the most loved and most hated women in America at the same time. The 1932 campaign is brutal. Franklin promises a new deal for the American people. Federal employment programs, banking regulation, direct aid to the needy. It's a radical vision of the role of government. And Eleanor is everywhere. She gives speeches in Franklin's name. She visits coal mines, shantytowns, overwhelmed hospitals. She speaks to workers, desperate mothers, and young people without a future. And something extraordinary happens. People respond to her, not because she's Franklin's wife, but because she speaks authentically. She doesn't use empty rhetoric. She tells stories of real people she's met. She talks about specific solutions. And most importantly, she listens, really listens, at every stop. Eleanor takes mental notes of the problems people mention, and when she returns, she reports them to Franklin and his advisors. She's becoming the eyes and ears of the campaign. November 1932. Franklin wins by a landslide. Herbert Hoover is swept aside. The American people have voted for change. And Eleanor Roosevelt, at age 48, becomes First Lady of the United States. She should be happy. But that night, after the celebrations, she sits alone in her room and cries. She knows the life she built so carefully is about to end. March 1933. Eleanor enters the White House as First Lady, and she immediately hates everything about it. The building is beautiful but oppressive. There are staff everywhere. Secret Service following her every moment. Rigid protocols about how she should dress, where she should sit, what she should say. The Chief of Staff, who has served First Lady for decades, hands her a list of her responsibilities. Organize state dinners, oversee the decor, be an elegant hostess at social events. No politics, no public opinions. Smile, look good, don't cause trouble. Eleanor looks at that list and feels as if she's being straitjacket. She spent the last 15 years building her own voice. And now she's supposed to shut up? Become a doll? Go back to being the Eleanor she was before the discovery of Lucy Mercer's letters? No, she can't. She won't. That first week, Eleanor breaks all the rules. She insists on driving her own car, something no First Lady has ever done. The Secret Service is horrified. She sets up a desk in her room, and begins personally responding to letters that arrive by the pile. Other first ladies delegated this task to staff, but Eleanor wants to read every story, every plea for help. And most scandalously, she announces she will continue holding press conferences, but only for female journalists. Eleanor Roosevelt's first press conference as First Lady is on March 8, 1933. 35 female journalists are crowded into a White House room. They are nervous, excited. In an era where journalism is dominated by men, where female reporters are relegated to covering gossip and fashion, Eleanor is giving them exclusive access to the White House. And not to talk about her dress or dinner menus, to talk about politics, social policies, what's really happening in government. Male journalists are furious. Their editors are furious. How are they going to get the stories if only women have access? Some newspapers are forced to hire their first female reporter just to cover the First Lady. Eleanor is achieving something extraordinary. She's creating jobs for women in journalism simply by existing in her own space. And at those press conferences, Eleanor is outspoken in a way no First Lady has been before. She talks about poverty, about the need for jobs programs, about civil rights. Conservatives are horrified. The First Lady must be seen, not heard. They write in editorials. But Eleanor doesn't stop. Every week, the press conferences continue. And every week, her influence grows. 1935. Eleanor takes an even more radical step. She begins writing a daily newspaper column called My Day. 6 days a week, 750 words about her life, her thoughts, her observations. At first, critics scoff. Who wants to read about what the First Lady has for breakfast or who she met at dinner? But Eleanor is more astute than she looks. She uses a column to talk about important issues disguised as personal anecdotes. She writes about visiting a school for poor children and, coincidentally, mentions the lack of funding. She writes about meeting a war veteran and, coincidentally, notes that he doesn't have access to medical care. She's engaging in political activism while appearing to simply share her day. And it works. My Day is syndicated in dozens, then hundreds of newspapers. Millions of Americans read it every morning. Eleanor Roosevelt has a direct line to the American people that no elected politician has. And editors can't easily censor her because she's technically only talking about her personal life. It's brilliant, it's subversive, and it's turning the First Lady into a more powerful political figure than many members of the cabinet. But Eleanor isn't content with words. She wants action, and she finds her opportunity in the impoverished mining communities of West Virginia. She visits an area where coal miners have been left jobless by mine collapses. Families live in shacks without electricity or running water. The children are malnourished. It's a heartbreaking scene. Eleanor conceives a bold plan. Arthurdale, an experimental community where the government will provide land, houses, schools, and employment opportunities for 50 mining families. It will be a model of what the New Deal can achieve. Eleanor is involved in every detail. The design of the houses, the school curriculum, the job opportunities. She invests her own money. She lobbies government agencies. She personally visits the site dozens of times. The project was controversial from the start. Conservatives attacked it as socialism. Construction problems and cost overruns provided ammunition for critics. But for Eleanor, Arthurdale represents something bigger than a housing project. It represents the idea that the government can and should help those left behind by capitalism. And although the project would eventually be considered a failure due to its costs, for the 50 families who received a home and an opportunity, Eleanor Roosevelt was a savior. 1939. Birmingham, Alabama. The Daughters of the American Revolution, a conservative organization of upper-class white women, deny African-American singer Marian Anderson permission to perform at Constitution Hall, their auditorium in Washington, D.C. The reason is explicit. Marian Anderson is black, and Constitution Hall has a whites-only policy. Eleanor is outraged. She's a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she publicly resigns in protest. The news is a bombshell. A First Lady resigning from a prestigious organization because of racial discrimination is unprecedented in 1939. The South is furious. Conservative newspapers violently attack her. She receives thousands of hate letters, many with death threats. But Eleanor doesn't back down. She works with Secretary of the Interior Harold Ikes to organize an alternative concert. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, 1939, Marian Anderson sings on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in front of 75,000 people. It's a historic moment. Eleanor doesn't physically attend for protocol and security reasons, but her presence is felt in every note Marian Anderson sings. It's a powerful statement. The First Lady of the United States is on the side of civil rights. This incident makes Eleanor public enemy number one in the segregationist South. Southern politicians, many of them Democrats who supposedly support Franklin, constantly attack her. They call her a blacks lover, a communist, and a race traitor. Cartoons and Southern newspapers portray her in grotesque and cruel ways. Some governors prohibit My Day from being published in their states. Eleanor receives death threats so frequently that the Secret Service asks her to carry a gun. She refuses at first, but eventually learns to shoot and carries a small pistol in her purse when traveling through the South. On several occasions, hostile mobs surround her car. Ku Klux Klan members burn her in effigy. It's dangerous, it's terrifying, but Eleanor doesn't stop. She visits schools for black children in the South. She meets with civil rights leaders. She pressures Franklin to support anti-lynching legislation, though he resists for fear of losing the support of Southern Democrats. And here lies one of the constant tensions in their political relationship. Eleanor is often more morally advanced than Franklin, pushing him toward positions he knows are correct but fears may be politically costly. But the most radical thing about Eleanor isn't just her political positions. It's how she fundamentally redefines what it means to be First Lady. She travels constantly, more than any First Lady in history. She visits factories, mines, farms, hospitals. Not ceremonial trips, but real working visits where she gets her hands dirty, talks to workers, and inspects conditions. During World War II, when the United States entered the conflict in 1941, Eleanor visits military bases, veterans' hospitals, and war factories. She travels to the South Pacific in 1943, visiting troops in combat zones. The generals are horrified. It's too dangerous. But Eleanor persists. The soldiers need to know that someone in Washington cares about them. And the soldiers love her. She doesn't give empty patriotic speeches. She sits with them, listens to their stories, takes notes of their complaints and concerns. When she returns, she lobbies the appropriate departments to resolve problems. The soldiers begin writing to her directly, thousands of letters, knowing that the First Lady actually reads their correspondence and responds. April 1945. Franklin is in Warm Springs, Georgia, his favorite retreat where he goes to rest from the stresses of war. Eleanor is in Washington, working as usual. She receives an urgent call. Franklin has suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He died instantly. Eleanor takes the first train to Georgia. The journey lasts hours. Hours to process the fact that the man with whom she shared 40 years of her life, a complicated, broken marriage, rebuilt on strange but functional terms, is gone. Hours to reflect on everything they accomplished together. Hours to wonder what comes next. When she arrives in Warm Springs, she discovers something that shatters her in ways she hadn't expected. Lucy Mercer was there. Franklin had been secretly seeing Lucy for years, breaking the promise he made decades earlier. The woman who destroyed their marriage was with her husband when he died. Eleanor maintains her composure in public, as always, but in private, the pain is almost unbearable, not only because of the renewed betrayal, but because she realizes she never fully knew the man with whom she shared her life. The funeral is massive. Millions mourn Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who guided them through the Depression and the war. But as the country mourns its leader, Eleanor wonders, who is she now? Without Franklin, without being First Lady, what is left for her? She is 60 years old. Most women her age will retire, live off their memories. But Eleanor Roosevelt is not like most women, and what comes next will be, paradoxically, her most important work. Because freed from the constraints of being First Lady, she is about to become something much greater, the moral conscience of the entire world. The question is the world ready for her? The days after the funeral are the hardest. Eleanor returns to the White House to pack. Harry Truman, the new president, needs to move. Eleanor walks through the empty rooms, the salons where she hosted hundreds of events, the offices where she worked on so many projects. 12 years of her life lived within these walls. And now she must go. The staff cries as they pack. Eleanor has been different from all the first ladies. She has treated the staff with respect, learned their names, their stories. She has fought for better working conditions for them, and now they will miss her presence. But Eleanor is calm in public, efficient, organized. It is only when she is alone in her room, late at night, that she allows the tears to flow. She's not crying just for Franklin. She's crying for the end of an era, for the death of a dream that was never fully fulfilled, the dream of a true marriage, of genuine love. She's crying for Lucy Mercer's final betrayal. But she's also crying for something deeper, fear. At 60 years old, what is she supposed to do now? Retire to Valkill and disappear? The idea terrifies her. But Harry Truman has other plans. In December 1945, just months after Franklin's death, Truman calls her into his office. He tells her that the United Nations, the new international organization created to prevent future world wars, needs American representatives for its first General Assembly, and he wants Eleanor to be one of them. Eleanor is surprised. She has no formal diplomatic experience. She has never held an official government position. But Truman insists. The world needs your voice, he tells her, especially now. Europe is in ruins. Millions of refugees are homeless. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is beginning. The world needs someone who can speak about human rights, about the dignity of ordinary people. And no one is more qualified than Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor accepts, but with trepidation. She will be the only woman in a 5-person delegation. The other 4 are men with decades of foreign policy experience, senators, career diplomats. And here she is, a 60-year-old widow whose only qualification is having served as First Lady. Reporters speculate that Truman appointed her out of sentimentality, to honor Franklin's memory. They don't take her appointment seriously. It's a mistake they will soon regret. January 1946. Eleanor arrives in London for the first session of the United Nations General Assembly. The city is unrecognizable. German bombing has left entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. People queue for hours for limited food rations. The winter is brutal and coal is scarce. This is victory, but it feels like defeat. Eleanor walks through the bombed-out streets and sees the scale of the destruction left by World War II. 50 million people dead, entire cities wiped off the map, and everywhere, refugees, people who have lost everything, who have no home to return to, wandering across Europe looking for any place that will accept them. The refugee crisis is immense, and the UN General Assembly must find solutions. The other members of the American delegation treat her with polite condescension. They assign her to Committee 3, which deals with humanitarian and social affairs. The men think it's a safe assignment, without real importance. Important decisions about international security, the global economy, those will be made in other committees. They can give the president's widow something to do without causing trouble. It's, again, a monumental mistake. But Committee 3 turns out to be one of the most controversial. It must deal with the massive refugee problem in Europe. And here arises a fundamental conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets insist that all refugees must be repatriated to their home countries, even by force if necessary. For millions of people who fled countries now controlled by communist regimes, this means a death sentence or imprisonment. Eleanor passionately argues that repatriation should be voluntary, that no one should be forced to return to a place where they fear for their lives. The Soviet delegate, Andrei Vyshinsky, an intimidating man with a reputation as a ruthless prosecutor during Stalin's purges, verbally attacks her. He calls her naive, sentimental, a woman who doesn't understand the intricacies of international politics. But Eleanor doesn't back down. In meeting after meeting, she debates with Vyshinsky. She meticulously prepares her arguments. She uses real-life stories from refugees she's met, and slowly, she wins the support of other delegations. Her ability to connect the abstract with the human, to put faces and names to statistics, is devastatingly effective. Wyszynski has political theories. Eleanor has people, and the people win. When a vote is finally taken, Committee 3 adopts the principle of voluntary repatriation. It is a huge victory for human rights. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman no one took seriously, is recognized as the architect of that victory. The other American delegates are astonished. Delegates from other countries begin seeking her out for consultations. And the international media realizes that they seriously underestimated the former First Lady. Eleanor returns to the United States as a hero, but she knows this is just the beginning, because now she has a new mission, one that will be the most important work of her life. The United Nations is creating a commission on human rights. Its purpose: to draft a universal declaration establishing the fundamental rights of every person on the planet. And in April 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt is elected president of that commission. It's an extraordinary honor. It's also an impossible task. How do you get countries with radically different cultures, religions, political systems, and philosophies to agree on what rights are universal? How do you convince dictatorships to sign a document on freedom? How do you balance national sovereignty with individual rights? Eleanor is 62 years old, and she's about to embark on the most difficult battle of her life. The commission is composed of 18 members from different countries: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, Great Britain, India, Chile, Lebanon, and others. Each brings its own agenda, its own priorities, its own red lines. The communists want emphasis on economic and social rights. Western democracies want emphasis on individual and political freedoms. Developing countries want to address colonialism. Arab countries have concerns about how the document will treat religion and family. And Eleanor must get everyone to agree. She chairs meetings with a mixture of firmness and diplomacy. She listens patiently to endless arguments. She seeks compromises when possible. She stands firm when necessary. She works 14, 16-hour days. She reads every draft, every proposed amendment. She learns about Islamic law, Confucian philosophy, African traditions. She is determined that this document will not be simply a Western imposition, but truly universal. The work is exhausting. Some sessions last until dawn. There are moments when it seems a committee will disintegrate into irreconcilable conflicts. But Eleanor keeps pushing, negotiating, searching for precise language that can unite rather than divide. The commission's vice chairman is a Chinese philosopher named Chong-Peng Chun. Brilliant, American-educated, and deeply versed in Confucian philosophy, Chong and Eleanor form an extraordinary intellectual partnership. He teaches her about concepts of rights in Eastern traditions. She teaches him about Western political pragmatism. Together, they search for a language that can resonate across cultures. Chong insists that the document must begin with inherent human dignity, not with rights granted by governments. It's a concept that exists in virtually every philosophical and religious tradition in the world. The idea that every person has value simply for being human. Eleanor sees the brilliance of this. If rights come from our shared humanity, then no government can legitimately take them away. He also works closely with René Cassin, a French jurist who survived World War I and whose family was murdered in the Holocaust. Cassin brings a moral urgency to the work. He has seen what happens when human rights are ignored. He is unwilling to allow the document to be weak or full of loopholes. And Charles Malik of Lebanon, an Orthodox Christian philosopher, ensures that Middle Eastern perspectives are heard. But the biggest obstacle is the Soviet Union. Its representative, Alexei Pavlov, has clear instructions from Moscow. Economic and social rights must take priority over political freedoms. And there must be an emphasis on the duties of individuals toward the state, not just rights against the state. This is a fundamentally different vision of human rights. The battles with Pavlov are epic. He is intelligent, well-prepared, and relentless. He uses every trick in the Soviet diplomatic handbook. He stalls objects of procedures and proposes amendments that would render the document inoperative. On several occasions, he threatens to have the Soviet Union withdraw from the Commission entirely, which would render the document almost meaningless in a world divided by the Cold War. Eleanor learns to fight on their own turf. She becomes adept at the rules of parliamentary procedure. She anticipates their objections. She prepares counterarguments. And she uses her most powerful weapon, world public opinion. When Pavlov blocks something, Eleanor makes sure the media knows exactly what and why. Public pressure becomes her leverage to move unshakable positions. 1948. After nearly 2 years of exhausting work, hundreds of meetings, and countless drafts, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is almost complete. 30 articles cover everything, from the right to life and liberty to the right to education and work, from the prohibition of slavery and torture to the right to freedom of expression and religion. It's not perfect. Eleanor knows this. There are compromises that hurt. The language on economic rights isn't as strong as socialists would have liked. The language on individual freedoms isn't as absolute as Western democracies would prefer. It doesn't specifically mention colonialism in the way developing countries had hoped, and it has no enforcement mechanism. It's aspirational, not legally binding. But Eleanor understands something fundamental. Perfection is the enemy of good. If you wait for a document that completely satisfies everyone, you'll never have one. This declaration, with all its imperfections, establishes for the first time in human history a common standard of rights that apply to all people everywhere. It's a monumental achievement. December 9th, 1948. Palais de Chaillot, Paris. The United Nations General Assembly meets to vote on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt takes the podium to give the final speech before the vote. The hall is packed. Delegates from 58 nations. Press from around the world. This is the moment that will define her legacy. Eleanor doesn't read from a prepared text. She speaks from the heart. She talks about why this document matters, not in abstract terms of international law, but in human terms. She talks about the millions who died in the war, about those who were tortured in concentration camps, about those who were enslaved, silenced, and disappeared. She talks about her hope that this declaration will be the beginning of a world where such atrocities are impossible. This document, he says, is not intended to be a declaration of law or legal obligation. It is a declaration of basic principles of human rights and freedoms. It is a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. His voice, which began timidly decades ago, now resonates with moral authority in that historic hall. The voting begins. One by one, nations raise their hands. 48 vote in favor, 0 against, 8 abstain, including the Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa, but none vote against. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is adopted. The hall erupts in applause. Delegates from around the world rise to their feet. Many have tears in their eyes. Eleanor remains at the podium, overwhelmed. She thinks of the rejected child she was, the betrayed wife, the woman who had to rebuild herself from the ashes of her broken dreams. And now, at 64, she has achieved something that will change the course of human history. The Declaration will become the basis for international treaties, national constitutions, and civil rights movements around the world. But while the room celebrates, Eleanor knows something no one else sees yet. A declaration on paper means nothing without people willing to fight for it. And she's about to discover that the truly difficult work wasn't writing the document. It'll be making the world comply with it. Because in the United States, her own country, one of the signers of the Declaration, millions of black citizens live without the basic rights the document promises. And Eleanor Roosevelt, now a private citizen without an official position, will have to decide. Can a 64-year-old woman defy her own government and fight for those her country had forgotten? The answer lies in the final episode. (1949). Eleanor returned from Paris as an international celebrity. The newspapers call her the First Lady of the World. She has achieved the impossible, uniting nations with opposing philosophies around a human rights document. But when she lands in New York, reality hits her immediately. The United States, the country that helped draft the Universal Declaration, has a massive human rights problem of its own. The South remains completely segregated. African Americans cannot eat in the same restaurants as whites. They cannot use the same bathrooms. They cannot sit in the front of buses. Schools are separate and deeply unequal. And in many southern states, black people are effectively deprived of the right to vote through poll taxes, rigged literacy tests, and Ku Klux Klan terrorism. Eleanor has spent 2 years talking about universal human rights. But what do those words mean if they don't apply at home? She has a choice to make. She can retire to Valkill, live off her international laurels, and write her memoirs in peace. Or she can become what America needs most and wants least, a national conscience that won't allow the country to ignore its own contradictions. She chooses battle. Eleanor becomes deeply involved with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She has been a supporter for years, but now makes her commitment public and prominent. She agrees to serve on its board. She attends its conventions. She gives speeches at its events. And most importantly, she lends her name and prestige to causes that no white figure of her social standing dares to publicly support. Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, becomes one of her closest collaborators. Walter is a fascinating man, technically black by segregation laws, but so light-skinned he can pass for white. He has used this ambiguity to infiltrate white Southern communities and investigate lynchings. His stories about racial violence in the South are devastating, and Eleanor amplifies them, writing about them in My Day and speaking about them at conferences. The attacks against her intensify. Southern politicians accuse her of betraying her race and class. White supremacist groups constantly threaten her. But Eleanor has learned something fundamental through decades of being attacked. Hatred from the wrong people is the best confirmation that you're doing the right thing. 1954. The Supreme Court hears the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which challenges segregation in public schools. It is one of the most important civil rights cases in American history. The NAACP has worked for years building the legal argument, and although Eleanor is not a lawyer, she has been part of the broader strategy, building public and moral pressure. When the Supreme Court unanimously rules that school segregation is unconstitutional, it is a social earthquake. The South is furious. Many states simply refuse to comply. Governors promise massive interception. Some districts close their public schools entirely rather than integrate them, and violence explodes. Black families trying to send their children to white schools are attacked by mobs. Eleanor uses every platform she has to support integration. She writes columns. She gives speeches. She meets with civil rights leaders. And when politicians ask why she can't understand the South's position, why she can't be reasonable about the pace of change, Eleanor responds with a simple truth. Human rights are non-negotiable. There is no reasonable way to deny people their dignity. September 1957. Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students attempt to attend the previously all-white Central High School. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus orders the National Guard to block its entrance, directly defying the federal integration order. The images are devastating. Black teenagers being spat upon, threatened, surrounded by mobs of white adults shouting obscenities. Eleanor is horrified. She writes an open letter to Governor Faubus, which is published in newspapers across the country. She reminds him that the United States signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She asks how he can justify denying these children their right to an education. She tells him that history will judge him harshly. It is a public moral rebuke from one of the most respected figures in the country. Faubus tries to respond, but there is no convincing defense for what the images clearly show. President Dwight Eisenhower, finally forced to act, sends federal troops to Little Rock. The 9 black students attend school under military protection. It's a powerful image, American soldiers protecting American children from other Americans. And Eleanor makes sure the world sees the contradiction. How can the United States lead the free world while treating its own citizens this way? The 1950s saw the birth of the modern civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks' resistance, the emerging leadership of a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., and Eleanor was there, supporting, amplifying, using her platform to give voice to this growing movement. She met Martin Luther King Jr. in 1958. He was 29. She was 74. But they immediately recognized something in each other, an unwavering commitment to nonviolent justice. King admired her courage. Eleanor admired his moral vision and strategy. They began a correspondence that continued until Eleanor's death. Eleanor uses My Day to explain and defend the tactics of the civil rights movement to white audiences who don't understand. When there are lunch counter sit-ins, she explains why nonviolent protest is necessary. When there are marches, she explains why waiting patiently for change isn't an option for people who have waited a century. She is doing the crucial work of translating the moral urgency of the movement for white Americans who prefer order over justice. 1960, John F. Kennedy is elected president. He is young, charismatic, and represents a new generation. Eleanor had supported Adlai Stevenson in the Democratic primary, but once Kennedy won the nomination, she loyally supported him, and Kennedy wisely sought her blessing and advice. He knew that Eleanor Roosevelt had a moral authority that he, as a young Catholic without much experience, needed. Kennedy reappoints her to the United Nations delegation. At 76, Eleanor returns to the diplomatic arena, but she also pressures Kennedy on civil rights. She tells him he must do more, faster. Kennedy is cautious, worried about losing the support of Southern Democrats. But Eleanor accepts no excuses. The time is now, she tells him. History won't wait while you make political calculations. Kennedy also appointed her chair of the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. This is a recognition that Eleanor has spent decades advocating not only for racial civil rights, but also for women's rights. The commission will examine discrimination in employment, education, and legal rights. It's another project that Eleanor, even at her advanced age, approaches with the same energy as a 30-year-old. But the body has limits that the spirit doesn't. 1962. Eleanor is 78 years old. She's worked nonstop for decades. She travels constantly. She gives speeches. She writes. She attends meetings. And her health begins to fail. First, it's back pain she ignores. Then a fever she tries to hide. Finally, doctors diagnose aplastic anemia, a terminal bone marrow disorder. Eleanor accepts the diagnosis with the same calm she's faced everything in her life. There's no hysteria, no self-pity. She simply asks how much time she has and what she can do in that time. The doctors estimate months, maybe a year if she's lucky. Eleanor nods. There's work to be done. She doesn't have time for illness. He continues working until he literally can't get out of bed. He writes columns from the hospital. He receives visitors seeking his advice. Even from his deathbed, he's trying to solve problems, help people, and advance causes. It's as if he's lived his entire life preparing to leave nothing unfinished. November 7, 1962. Eleanor Roosevelt dies at her home in New York City. She is 78 years old. She has lived a life that spanned almost the entire 20th century. She was born in the Victorian era and died in the space age. She saw 2 world wars. She saw the rise and fall of empires. She saw the birth of the civil rights movement she helped nurture. Her last words, according to those present, were simple: I want to be useful. To the very end, what motivated her wasn't fame or power, but usefulness. To be needed. To serve. It's the same promise she made decades ago as a young woman visiting factories in New York. The promise that guided every major decision of her life. The news of her death sparked an extraordinary global response. Presidents, prime ministers, and leaders from around the world sent condolences. But most moving were the letters from ordinary people, factory workers, veterans, refugees she helped save, women who found inspiration in her life, civil rights activists she supported, thousands upon thousands of letters from people who felt Eleanor Roosevelt saw them, heard them, and fought for them. The funeral is in Hyde Park, next to Franklin. Presidents and dignitaries attend, but Eleanor asks for simplicity. She doesn't want pomp. She doesn't want monuments. She wants to be remembered not for titles, but for work. President Kennedy gives a eulogy. She would rather light candles and curse the darkness, he says. It's a perfect description of how she lived. But perhaps the most powerful tribute comes from the African Americans who travel from all over the South to be there. Some walk for days. They have no money for transportation, but they feel they must be present. This white woman of the aristocracy, who could have lived a carefree life of privilege, chose to fight for them when no one else with her power would. They stand on the funeral procession route, heads bowed, weeping openly. Martin Luther King Jr. is there. He is visibly moved. Years later, he will say that Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the most important figures in paving the way for the civil rights movement, that without her decades of work educating white Americans, building coalitions, and challenging racism from within the establishment, the movement would have had a much more difficult path. The years following her death demonstrate how ahead of her time Eleanor was. 1963, the March on Washington, where King gives his I Have a Dream speech. 1964, the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Each of these victories was built on foundations Eleanor helped establish. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, her greatest achievement, became the basis for liberation movements around the world. When Nelson Mandela fought against apartheid in South Africa, he cited the Declaration. When dissidents fought against dictatorships in Latin America, they invoked the Declaration. When women fought for equal rights, they used the language of the Declaration. Eleanor didn't live to see all of these victories, but her work made them possible, and the women who came after her found paths she helped pave. Hillary Clinton will say she had imaginary conversations with Eleanor in the White House. Michelle Obama will talk about how Eleanor redefined what a first lady could be. Generations of women in politics, activism, and public service will trace their inspiration to this woman who refused to accept the limitations that her gender and her era tried to impose on her. The story of Eleanor Roosevelt is a story of transformation, of a rejected child who became the most influential woman of her century, of a betrayed wife who turned her pain into power, of a privileged aristocrat who dedicated her life to the underprivileged. It is a story of how suffering, if it doesn't destroy you, can turn you into empathy, of how rejection can teach you to value the rejected, of how betrayal can free you from illusions and allow you to see the world clearly. Eleanor Roosevelt was never beautiful by the standards of her time. She never had the happy marriage she dreamed of. She never received the romantic love she longed for, but she achieved something rarer and more important. She lived a life of meaning, a life that mattered, a life that changed the world in measurable and lasting ways. When he died, he didn't leave a vast fortune. He didn't leave marble monuments bearing his name. What he left behind was something more valuable, a map for how to live with purpose, how to turn invisibility into voice, how to transform weakness into strength, how to use privilege in the service of those without it, how to be useful. After Eleanor's death, her children begin the painful process of sorting through her belongings. In Valkill, they find rooms filled with correspondence. Eleanor kept everything: letters from presidents, ordinary citizens, world leaders. But something is strange. Certain periods of her life have inexplicable gaps, years where personal correspondence simply doesn't exist, especially letters between her and her closest friends. Historians will eventually discover that Eleanor systematically burned certain letters before her death, particularly those exchanged with Lorena Hickok, a journalist with whom Eleanor had a deeply intimate relationship that lasted decades. The surviving letters, those Lorena kept and released years after her death, reveal a side of Eleanor the public never knew. Hick, as Eleanor called Lorena, was the closest person to her during the White House years. The letters are passionate, vulnerable, and filled with longing. Eleanor writes about missing his kisses, about counting the days until they can be together, about wishing they had a life where they could be together openly. Was it a physical romance or an emotional intimacy so deep it used the language of romance? Historians debate, but what is undeniable is that Eleanor loved Lorena in a way she never loved Franklin. Eleanor Roosevelt lived in a time where certain loves couldn't be named, where women who loved women lived in shadows, using coded language. finding ways of being together that society could accept without fully understanding. Eleanor never spoke publicly about the nature of her deepest relationships, but she created spaces where she could be herself. Valkill wasn't just a retreat. It was a refuge where Eleanor lived with her closest friends, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, who were a couple, where she could create a domestic life that didn't revolve around a man, where she could define family on her own terms. In that sense, Eleanor was extraordinarily modern, creating living spaces that challenged the heterosexual norms of her time, without explicitly stating what she was doing. This dimension of her life adds depth to her activism. Eleanor understood what it was like to live a truth that society couldn't accept. She understood what it was like to love in secret. She understood what it was like to construct an identity outside of approved molds. And perhaps this made her more empathetic to all those who lived on the margins, black people in a white supremacist society, the poor in a society that blamed them for their poverty, homeless refugees in a world that wanted to close its doors to them. There's another uncomfortable truth in Eleanor's story. She wasn't a good mother. Her own children admitted this years later. Eleanor was so consumed by her work, by her causes, that her children grew up largely raised by nannies and the ever-present Sarah. When Eleanor was physically present, she was often emotionally absent, working on correspondence, preparing speeches, taking calls. Her children had complicated lives. 4 of the 5 children had multiple divorces. There were problems with alcohol, like their father and grandfather before them. There were conflicts with money, minor scandals. And while none of them blamed Eleanor directly, it's impossible not to see the connection. She gave them everything except what they needed most: her constant presence, her undivided attention. Anna, her eldest daughter, had the most complex relationship with Eleanor. There were periods of intense closeness and periods of painful estrangement. Anna eventually became Franklin's confidant during his later years, which created tension with Eleanor. And it was Anna who hid from Eleanor that Lucy Mercer was visiting Franklin, a betrayal Eleanor forgave but that left scars. Eleanor Roosevelt was a mass of contradictions. She championed workers' rights but employed domestic staff and paid them modest wages. She fought for racial equality but used language we would consider patronizing today. She championed women's rights but sometimes reinforced stereotypes about female roles. She passionately advocated for European refugees but was less vocal about the injustices against Japanese Americans interned during World War II. These contradictions don't diminish her legacy, but they do make it more human. Eleanor was no saint. She was a person of her time trying to see beyond her time, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing. She made mistakes. She had blind spots. She hurt people unintentionally. And sometimes her need to be useful, to be needed, led her to intrude where she wasn't welcome. But what's remarkable is that Eleanor was willing to evolve, to learn. When young civil rights activists in the 1960s challenged her for not being radical enough, she listened. When younger feminists questioned some of her positions, she considered their arguments. Until the end of her life, Eleanor Roosevelt was growing, changing, trying to be better. Being Eleanor Roosevelt came at a price. The FBI kept a massive file on her, treating her as a potential subversive threat. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, despised her and kept constant tabs on her. Her phones were tapped. Her associations were monitored. Any connection, however tangential, to organizations the FBI considered suspicious was documented. The death threats were constant. Especially after her civil rights work, Eleanor received letters filled with racial hatred and graphic threats of violence. The Secret Service begged her to be more careful, to travel less, to expose herself less. She refused. If they have to kill me, she said, let them kill me doing something useful. Living under that level of constant scrutiny and hostility took its psychological toll. Eleanor suffered from insomnia. She had periods of deep depression that she hid from the public. In private letters, she sometimes expressed existential fatigue, a feeling that she would never be enough, that for every problem she helped solve, 10 more appeared. But every morning she got up and went back to work. One of the most consistent criticisms of Eleanor, especially from the left, was that she wasn't radical enough, that she worked within the system rather than overthrowing it. that she accepted compromises when she should have demanded revolution. And there's truth in this. Eleanor was fundamentally a reformer, not a revolutionary. She believed in changing the system from within. This frustrated many. The socialists who wanted her to advocate for the nationalization of industries. The pacifists who wanted her to denounce all wars. The civil rights activists who wanted her to demand immediate integration without concessions. Eleanor sympathized with many of these positions, but she almost always chose the path of pragmatism over ideological purism. His argument was that incremental progress was better than no progress at all, that a small advance now was better than waiting for the perfect revolution that might never arrive, that working with imperfect people in an imperfect system was the only way to achieve real change. Not everyone agreed, but the results suggest his approach worked. The rights he helped secure were real, tangible, and improved real lives. Eleanor Roosevelt was born into extreme wealth, but had a complicated relationship with money all her life. After Franklin's death, she discovered her personal finances were a mess. Franklin had made poor investments. Eleanor had consistently given money to causes and people in need without keeping records. She found herself in a position where, at age 60, she needed to work to live. This made her vulnerable in ways people wouldn't expect from someone with her name. She had to give lectures for money. She had to write her column, even though she was exhausted. She had to be careful about spending in ways she hadn't been when she was First Lady. Some saw this as hypocritical, an aristocrat playing working class. But the reality is that Eleanor experienced a version of economic insecurity that gave her an additional window into how most people live. And this made her even more effective as an advocate. When she spoke about the need for Social Security, pensions, and health insurance, it wasn't just abstract theory. She was aware of her own financial vulnerability. She understood that without safety nets, even people from privileged families could find themselves in trouble. Imagine what those without her name, without her connections, without her education faced. Throughout her life, Eleanor sought love in ways that were never fully fulfilled. After Franklin, after Lorena Hickok, there were others who captured her heart. Earl Miller, her bodyguard when she was First Lady in New York, was a close confidant with whom she maintained intimate correspondence for decades. Some historians speculate about a romance, though the consensus is that the relationship was more one of deep emotional support than physical. And there was David Gurwitch, a much younger doctor whom Eleanor met in her later years. Eleanor clearly loved him, in a way that bordered on the romantic, even though David was interested in other people. Eleanor maintained their friendship, helping him professionally, even attending his wedding to another woman. It was painful, but Eleanor had learned to love without expecting complete reciprocity. These patterns reveal something fundamental about Eleanor. She never fully overcame her childhood wound, the feeling of not being lovable enough. She sought emotional validation in ways that sometimes made her vulnerable to being hurt, but she also developed an extraordinary capacity to love generously without demanding possession. She could love people knowing they would never love her back, and find meaning in it anyway. At the end of her life, Eleanor was surrounded by people but essentially alone. Her adult children had their own complicated lives. Her closest friends had died or grown apart. The political movements she helped create had passed her by, a younger generation taking the lead. She was respected, honored, admired. But was she loved in the way she secretly longed for? Did anyone know her fully? Probably not. And perhaps that is the ultimate tragedy of Eleanor Roosevelt. She dedicated her life to making others feel seen, heard, and valued. But she herself remained largely hidden. She kept secrets. She burned letters. She presented a public version of herself that was powerful but incomplete. The real woman, with all her longings, her pains, her contradictions, remained partially hidden. Was she happy? It's an impossible question to answer. Eleanor found meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in her work. She experienced moments of joy, deep connection, and accomplishment. But happiness in the simple, everyday sense? Probably not. Her life was too complicated, too public, too full of responsibility for simple happiness. But she achieved something perhaps more important, a life that mattered. And in the end, that was what she wanted most. The real Eleanor Roosevelt is more complicated, more interesting, and more human than the icon history sometimes presents. She was brave, but also afraid. She was strong, but also vulnerable. She fought for justice, but also made compromises. She loved deeply, but often without complete reciprocation. She was an imperfect mother, a wife in a broken marriage, a woman with secrets she took to the grave. But these complexities don't diminish her importance. If anything, they make her more inspiring. Because Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't a saint born with innate courage. She was a deeply wounded person who chose to transform her pain into action. She was someone who made mistakes and moved on. Someone who was rejected and used that experience to stand up for the rejected. Someone who knew betrayal and chose not to become cynical. Her final message isn't that we must be perfect to do good. It's that we must try anyway, with all our imperfections, all our flaws, all our limitations. That a life of meaning is possible even if we don't have all the answers, even if we don't always do the right thing, even if we never find the love we seek. Eleanor Roosevelt taught us that we can be useful, and in the end, that's enough. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she shepherded, has been translated into more than 500 languages. It is the most translated document in the world after the Bible. It has inspired more than 80 international human rights treaties. It has been incorporated into the constitutions of nations on every continent. When activists in Hong Kong protest for democracy, they carry copies of the Declaration. When women in the Middle East fight for equality, they cite its articles. When refugees seek asylum, they invoke its principles. The Declaration has not created a perfect world. Human rights violations occur every day, but it has created a common language, a standard against which governments can be measured and held accountable. And that was precisely Eleanor's vision, not to create a utopia overnight, but to establish principles that people could use in their struggles for justice, to give them conceptual and moral tools, to create international shame around certain practices. Progress would be slow, imperfect, with setbacks, but the direction would be set. And that's exactly what happened. Eleanor Roosevelt completely redefined what a first lady could be. Before her, the role was purely ceremonial. After her, it was impossible to return to that model. Every first lady who came after had to decide: follow Eleanor's model or fight her expectations. But ignoring her legacy was impossible. Lady Bird Johnson used her position to champion environmental conservation. Betty Ford spoke openly about breast cancer and addiction. Rosalind Carter attended cabinet meetings and worked on mental health policy. Hillary Clinton attempted to spearhead healthcare reform. Michelle Obama created initiatives on childhood obesity and girls' education globally. Each, in her own way, was operating in the space Eleanor opened. The idea that a first lady could be an active political figure with her own agenda. Even first ladies who chose more traditional roles had to justify that choice in terms of the post-Eleanor narrative. Laura Bush emphasized education and literacy. Melania Trump chose specific causes. The role had been permanently transformed. It was no longer acceptable to simply smile and look good. Substance, work, and impact were expected. Eleanor made this inevitable. When second-wave feminism exploded in the 1960s and 1970s, activists looked back on Eleanor as a complicated figure. On the one hand, she had been cautious about the radical suffrage movement, preferring incremental change. On the other hand, she had lived a life that defied every limitation imposed on women. Feminists debated, was Eleanor one of them or a relic of a more conservative feminism? The answer, of course, is both. Eleanor operated within the constraints of her time while constantly pushing against them. She didn't use the language of modern feminism because it didn't yet exist, but she lived feminist principles: economic autonomy, meaningful work, the rejection of traditional roles, relationships based on equality rather than submission. Feminists eventually claimed her as a predecessor, recognizing that the path she blazed made their movement possible. And Eleanor had planted specific seeds that blossomed into the women's movement. The Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which she led in her later years, produced a report in 1963 that documented systematic discrimination against women. That report became a blueprint for the feminist activism to come. Eleanor didn't live to see the second wave of feminism, but she helped create the conditions for it to happen. The civil rights movement Eleanor nurtured achieved monumental victories in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the integration of schools, though slow and resisted, the legal end of Jim Crow segregation. Had Eleanor lived to see these achievements, she would have wept with joy, but she would also have recognized that the work was not finished, because legal equality doesn't mean real equality. Economic inequalities persist. Police violence against black communities continues. Mass incarceration has created a new form of racial injustice. Schools are more segregated now than in the 1970s, not by law but by geography and economics. Eleanor understood that rights on paper need to be constantly defended, that each generation must reaffirm its commitment to justice, and her approach to activism, always connecting the political with the personal, telling human stories behind the statistics. That approach has become the standard model. When Black Lives Matter mobilizes protests, they're using techniques Eleanor helped pioneer, making the invisible visible, humanizing the dehumanized, creating moral pressure that compels political action. The movement looks different, using technology Eleanor never imagined, but the underlying strategy is clear echoes of her work. All over the world, there are people who owe their lives to Eleanor Roosevelt, the Jewish refugees who escaped the Holocaust because she pushed for changes in immigration policies, the families who found asylum after World War II because she fought for the principle of voluntary repatriation, the children who grew up in the experimental communities she created and who would otherwise have known only poverty. These impacts multiply across generations. A saved refugee becomes a father, a mother, who has children who have children. Entire families exist because Eleanor Roosevelt fought for abstract principles that had very concrete consequences. It's impossible to calculate how many lives were directly and indirectly touched by her work, but the number is in the millions. And many of these refugees and their descendants have dedicated their lives to continuing the work Eleanor began. They became human rights activists, social workers, and politicians fighting for justice. They carried her example back to their own countries, their own struggles. The impact ripples out like ripples in a pond, reaching places Eleanor never visited, causes she never knew about, but which were enabled by the principles she established. Eleanor Roosevelt was a teacher at heart. Even while she was First Lady, she continued to teach at Todd Hunter School, and her educational philosophy, which she learned from Marie Sylvester, spread through her students and the institutions she supported. Education not as memorization of facts, but as training in critical thinking, not as preparation for predefined roles, but as a tool for imagining and creating new possibilities. The progressive schools Eleanor supported became models. The idea that education should connect students with real social problems, that it should include community service, that it should teach active citizenship, not just passive knowledge. Those ideas spread. They didn't win completely. There was always conservative resistance. But they became part of the educational debate in ways they hadn't been before Eleanor. And her emphasis on girls' education was particularly transformative. Eleanor passionately believed that girls should receive the same rigorous education as boys, that they should be encouraged to have ambitions beyond marriage, that they should learn to think for themselves. Generations of professional women, leaders, and activists can trace their education to schools and programs that Eleanor supported or inspired. In moments of moral crisis, people still ask themselves, what would Eleanor do when an injustice arises and the right response is unclear? When the ethical path is difficult, costly, or unpopular, when courage is required but fear is overwhelming. Eleanor has become a kind of moral compass, a reference point for thinking about how to live with integrity. This doesn't mean Eleanor had all the answers. As we've seen, she made mistakes, had blind spots, and made compromises that not everyone would approve of, but her life demonstrated certain principles that are timeless. Facing fear by doing the fear thing anyway. Listening to the marginalized, using privilege to serve the underprivileged, working tirelessly for causes greater than oneself. These principles remain relevant. And the question, what would Eleanor do, isn't seeking a specific policy answer. It's seeking a reminder about how to face difficult decisions with courage, with compassion, with a willingness to act even when the action is imperfect. Eleanor didn't wait to have all the answers before acting. She acted with the best information and intention she had, knowing she would make mistakes. But that inaction was worse than imperfection. Today, in 2025, the world faces crises Eleanor never imagined, but that require exactly the kind of moral leadership she exemplified. A climate crisis that threatens human existence. Economic inequality, reaching levels not seen since Eleanor's time. Mass migrations of people fleeing war, poverty, and environmental collapse. The rise of authoritarianism and nationalism that threaten the human rights Eleanor helped establish. What would Eleanor say about these challenges? Probably the same thing she said in her time, that human rights are universal and non-negotiable, that privileged people have an obligation to use their power to help the vulnerable. That change is difficult and slow, but possible if enough people commit. That despair is an indulgence we can't afford because there's too much work to do, and her personal example remains instructive. In an era of cynical politicians and performative social media activism, Eleanor reminds us that real justice work is difficult, tedious, and requires long-term commitment without instant gratification. It requires attending countless boring meetings, reading dense documents, negotiating with people you don't like, making endless phone calls, writing letters no one will read. It's unglamorous work that she did with discipline for decades. That's the model we need. Every generation rediscovers Eleanor Roosevelt. Young activists encounter her writings and are surprised by how relevant they remain. Scholars continue to publish new studies, discovering new dimensions of her life. Hollywood continues to try to capture her story in films and TV series. Every decade, it seems, Eleanor resurfaces in the public consciousness when the world needs a reminder that change is possible. This happened in the 1970s when the women's movement was at its peak. It happened in the 1990s when Hillary Clinton invoked her as a model for an active First Lady. It happened after September 11th when the United States faced questions about security versus freedom and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights became relevant again. And it's happening now, in an era of extreme polarization, when we need to remember that it is possible to work with people with whom we disagree without sacrificing principles. Each resurrection reveals different aspects of Eleanor. Queer historians have reclaimed her story as part of LGBTQ+ history, exploring her relationships with women. Anti-racist activists study her civil rights work. Refugee advocates invoke her battle for voluntary repatriation. Eleanor has become a rich enough, complex enough figure that each generation finds something different in her that speaks to their own struggles. And this, perhaps, is the true test of historical greatness. Not that someone is perfect or universally admired, but that their life contains enough depth, enough complexity, enough fundamental human relevance that each generation can learn something new. Eleanor Roosevelt passes that test brilliantly. If Eleanor could speak to us now, decades after her death, what would she say? She probably wouldn't say much. Eleanor wasn't given to grand pronouncements. She preferred action to words, although she used words powerfully when necessary. But based on how she lived, what she prioritized, what she consistently stood for, her message would go something like this. Don't wait to be perfect to act. Don't wait to have all the answers. Don't wait for someone else to solve the problems. Start where you are with what you have, doing what you can. Be useful. That's the measure of a life. Were you useful? Did you leave the world a little better than you found it? Did you alleviate some suffering? Did you stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves? Don't let fear paralyze you. Fear is inevitable. We all feel it. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing in spite of the fear. And you'll find that every time you face the fear by doing the feared thing, it gets a little easier the next time. Not much easier, but a little. And those small increments of courage accumulate over a lifetime. Don't look for gratitude. Most justice work is thankless. You do it because it's right, not because someone will applaud you. In fact, If you're doing truly important justice work, you'll probably be attacked, misunderstood, and hated. Accept it as a sign that you're doing something meaningful. Eleanor Roosevelt died on November 7th, 1962. But in a very real sense, she never died. She lives every time a refugee invokes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights she championed. She lives every time a woman enters politics and redefines her role beyond the ceremonial. She lives every time someone uses their privilege to stand up for the marginalized. She lives every time someone chooses to be helpful rather than comfortable. Her story teaches us the most fundamental truth about social change. It's made by people, not abstract historical forces, not Marxist inevitability. Imperfect people who choose to act. A rejected child became the most influential woman of the 20th century not because she had superpowers, but because she chose, again and again, for decades, to use her pain as fuel for compassion rather than bitterness. That choice is available to all of us. We don't need to be First Lady. We don't need to have the last name Roosevelt. We don't need access to presidents and world leaders. We need simply to decide that our lives will have meaning beyond our personal comfort, that we will be useful, that we will face our fears by doing the feared things, that we will not accept the world as it is, but will work for the world as it could be. Eleanor Roosevelt showed us the way, not a perfect way, not an easy way, but a way that works, a way that transforms lives, societies, history. And that way is still open, waiting for the next person brave enough, stubborn enough, committed enough to walk it. Will it be you? The question Eleanor leaves us with isn't whether change is possible. It's whether we're willing to do the difficult, unglamorous, long-term work that change requires. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of his extraordinary life. That ordinary people, even the deeply wounded, even the rejected, even betrayed, can do extraordinary things if they simply refuse to give up, if they choose courage over comfort, if they choose service over safety, if they choose to be useful. Eleanor Roosevelt was useful, immensely, tirelessly, brilliantly useful. And in being so, she became immortal, not in the sense of living forever, but in the deepest sense, creating ripples that keep expanding long after the stone disappears underwater. Those ripples keep moving. They keep touching lives. They keep inspiring action. And as long as there are people who need reminding that change is possible, that justice is worth the fight, that one life can matter, Eleanor Roosevelt will live on, not as ancient history, but as a calling to the present, not as a museum, but as a manual, not as a past, but as the promise of the future we can still build. The question isn't whether Eleanor Roosevelt was important. It's whether we will be worthy of her example. It's whether we will have the courage to be as useful as she was. It's whether we will transform our own pain into power, our own privilege into service, our own fear into action. That is the invitation her life extends to us. That is the torch she passed on to future generations. And it burns still, waiting for willing hands to carry it forward toward a more just, more compassionate, more humane future. Eleanor Roosevelt taught us that we can. Now we must decide, will we? This is the story of Eleanor Roosevelt, the child no one wanted, the wife who was betrayed, the first lady who broke all the rules, the widow who became the world's moral voice. She wasn't perfect. She made mistakes. She had doubts. She felt fear. But she got up every morning and chose to be of use. And in that simple yet profound choice, she changed the world. His story didn't end in 1962 when his heart stopped beating. It continues every day in the people who invoke his name, his principles, his example. It continues in every act of moral courage, in every defense of human rights, in every refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Eleanor Roosevelt showed us that one life can matter, that suffering can be transformed, that power can be used for good, that change is possible. Now it's up to us to prove that we've learned our lesson. It's up to us to prove that her life wasn't in vain. It's up to us to be useful. Because in the end, that's the only question that matters. Were we useful? Did our life matter? Did we leave something better than we found it? Eleanor Roosevelt answered those questions with a resounding yes. Now it's our turn, dedicated to all those who choose to be of service, to those who transform pain into power, to those who refuse to accept injustice, to those who believe, against all evidence, that one person can make a difference. Eleanor Roosevelt proved them right.